Welcome to Is Masculinity Toxic for Boys? Adults project their preoccupations onto kids today, and with good reason. Thinking about how we raise the next generation forces us in a semi-conscious way to consider what kind of society we want to be. What do we value? What aspects of our culture do we want to pass on? And more importantly, maybe, what aspects of our culture do we need to pass on to ensure the future? Is masculinity important to the future, or is it something that we've outgrown? And what about boys themselves and the state that they're in? And I think boys are in trouble. They've fallen behind girls in school. They're less likely to get into college. And once they get into college, they're less likely to finish. They're more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. In the United States now, about 20% of American boys will be diagnosed with ADHD by the time they're in high school, and millions of those will be medicated. This is new research that's come out that showed that young men are apt to voluntarily remove themselves from the workforce at some point in their 20s to play video games. So, a lot to think about there. Anyway, I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers to discuss masculinity in boys. First, we have John Waters, Irish newspaper columnist. Then we have Professor Camille Paglia, who's a professor of humanities and media studies at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, the author of Sexual Personae, Art and Decadence from Nefertiti to Emily Dickinson. And she has a new book, which is called Free Women, Free Men, Sex, Gender, and Feminism. Then we have Martin Daubney, who is an award-winning editor, broadcaster, and a columnist with the Telegraph. And then finally, Christopher Beckett, who is a client and operations manager for the Elite International Baccalaureate Program and a former pastoral support worker with the Windham College. Anyway, thank you. So we'll start by inviting our panelists to share their thoughts for about 5 minutes, and then we'll go straight out to the audience. John.
Gustav Le Bon, 100 years ago or more, identified that we all participate in a herd mentality, and that this is part of each one of our thinking. That we have a personal way of thinking about things, which involves our personal lives, our self-interest, and so on. And then there's a herd mentality, which we become whipped up as a result of propaganda or mob mentalities, and so on. And this issue of boys is actually an area in which you can see very clearly how this works, and how it works to great disadvantage of boys. Because even though I constantly, when I speak about this issue now, I say to audiences, do you have sons? And of course, an audience like this, the chances are that at least 1/3 of you will have sons. Possibly more than half you will have brothers, younger brothers, who will be implicated in these questions. And yet, as a collective, we seem to be unable to take on board any question as to why these boys are affected by things. In addition to things that Nancy made, there are two, I think, which are far worse than either, and which go to all of the things that Nancy listed. One is the fact that we communicate to boys that one of the most central strands of meaning, which is available to the human person, i.e., in our society, i.e., parenthood, will only exist for them by concession of the mother. And the second thing is that 80% in all our societies, including this one, including my one in Ireland, 80% of suicides are male. And as Schopenhauer said, the reason for suicide is actually quite simple. Schopenhauer put it like this: when the terrors of life exceed the terrors of death, man will put an end to his life. So why are men afraid? They live in a culture which terrorizes them. They live in a culture which demonizes them, and which hides this under all kinds of pseudo-respectable and toleration-based ideologies. I've been talking about this for 20 years in Ireland. I started 22 years ago. I wrote a play called Long Black Coat about a father and his father and trying to answer the question which the old man put to him: where is your son? His son was not there and never appeared. This is a central question of our civilization, that we have taken from boys, not just their children, but the meaning their children would bring to them and to their lives. Now, I want to kind of go into it a little bit more deeply, and we don't have a lot of time. 20 years is a long time to build up an intelligence about these things, because I started off thinking that this was an oversight I thought that this is because people have overlooked something. And then I realized, no, they haven't overlooked anything. This is intentional. They intend this. This is a constructed part of our culture to demonize men and to banish men and to make men obsolescent. And it is fed. There's a wonderful book, well, not a great book in terms of writing, but in terms of information, Spreading Misandry. It came out about 10 years ago in America. And it went through right from Dagwood Bumstead to, Friends, the effect of popular culture on our consciousness, in which we are constantly being pummeled with images and ideas of men which destroys our sense of masculinity. And here's the point. It is not. You see, there's an extraordinary inversion at the core of all this. Extraordinary inversion. And it's actually in the title here. It's amazing how a trope can be adopted. And suddenly, you cannot now even, I defy any of you, think the word masculinity without the word toxic coming in one or other side of it. Like a Google search. This is what they've done. So, I'm running out of time already. I have a lot of stuff to say about Donald Trump, and that is it, because this is relevant. This is relevant. I'll just say this. There was a movie came out last year, Robert De Niro's latest atrocity. It was called The Intern. And it was about an old guy who goes as an intern to a fashion shop, and the woman is called Jules. And there's a line in the movie once where she sees De Niro's there beside her, and she says to these guys who are all these wimpy, kind of chinless, shoulderless wonders, and she says, how did it happen that in a generation we went from Jack Nicholson and Harrison Ford to you guys? Well, this is what. And this is the amazing thing. Hollywood did this. He was a perpetrator of this. And it's literally like being mugged in the street, and the mugger comes and he beats the head of you. And every so often he stops to say, "You all right? You all right?" Boom, boom, boom.
Okay, well, the name of my new book is Free Women, Free Men, because I'm demanding for an end to the war against men that has been going on in second wave feminism now for so many decades. I am really a product of first wave feminism because I became interested in the 1960s before Betty Friedan even wrote her book about the feminine mystique. I became very interested in Amelia Earhart and Katharine Hepburn and all these women of the 1920s and 30s who were animated by the great acquisition of the vote for women in both Britain and the United States. Those women of that generation included Dorothy Parker, Dorothy Thompson, and Morrow Lindbergh, so many of them, did not denigrate men in calling for women's rights. They demanded simply equal opportunity for women to achieve at the same level as what men had done in each career. All right. They admired what men had done. I admired what men have done. Okay? If people cannot look at history and see how men created civilization from, as I say in the book, from the Mesopotamian irrigation projects and the pyramids, down through the great, art form and so on. What are we doing? The real toxins, okay, are in feminist theory that poisons young women's minds against men. Many problems that women endure are not due to men; it's due to systemic problems. For most of human history, we were in the agrarian era when there was a natural division of labor and there was a world of women and a world of men. Right. So we are still trying to sort out what's happened since the Industrial Revolution made it possible for women now to support themselves through jobs, to get jobs outside of the home, no longer to be dependent, wonderfully, on father, husband, brother, okay, for sustenance. Right. But the end result in the 20th century is this movement toward, from the manufacturing base, okay, to service sector jobs, now a job requiring much higher levels of education, therefore very long periods in the classroom of college and then postgraduate education. So what we've ended up with is a kind of system that favors women. Women like to work, on the whole. Most women, the overwhelming majority of women, like to work in a safe, clean, quiet, secure environment. Okay, that's why they're very good at office work. Right? With the decline of a manufacturing base, boys have less opportunity to define themselves as men. Okay, to master a craft the way in the agrarian period their fathers had. They learned to be a carpenter. They learned, to work with metals as their fathers had. Right? So there has been a real undermining of the natural basis of male identity in the acquisition of a skill. Right now, the way that the public school system is run, at least in the United States, I can't speak for Britain, okay, but it's an all-female environment. The men who are present in it have already been doctored and neutered, okay? All right, the boys are experiencing public schools as a prison, okay? Everything that is most boy-like, all the natural vitality and energy of boys, all right, is defined as disruptive and disorderly, okay? They are so constrained, okay? It's awful, it's suffocating, and that's why they have escaped into the world of video games. Now, you mentioned the issue about Hollywood. So true, okay? At the beginning of Hollywood, in the 1920s and 1930s, the actors were drawn in, okay, were discovered because they looked photogenic, who were actually natural men who had worked with their hands. So, for example, Clark Gable had worked in the oil fields, okay? You had Robert Mitchum, who was just like, toting lumber, and they said, hey, you could possibly be in front of the camera. Or Gary Cooper, hey, how about you getting in front of the camera, et cetera, et cetera. So these were men who understood men. Okay? They had a natural density of personality, everything about them. Now, okay, what we have, okay, is our actors, okay, they want to be actors since they're 3 and 4. They're going to be an actor, okay? They go take dance lessons and voice lessons and so on and so forth. They learn how to be men by looking at images on the screen. So what we've got, most of our contemporary actors, all right, are simply third generation removed from Marlon Brando, okay? All right, they're still doing Marlon Brando. It's all false. It's all phony. They have the density of parakeets, okay? The actors today. So I absolutely agree with you, okay, is that where can young men look, okay, for role models today? There's no place to look. Okay? I'll stop because otherwise I'll just go on. All right. I'm wondering. All right.
How do you follow Camille? Okay, I want to talk about labels, because don't we just like to label each other these days? Men or toxic. They will never amount to anything. I was told that when I was a boy. I'm a coal miner's son from Nottingham. I was told my life would never amount to anything. I couldn't write till I was 5. I can remember the shame of being stigmatized and put in the corner. I remember the shame of one of the most difficult things I ever saw in my life, which became one of the most beautiful life lessons I ever had from my father, who was illiterate and was told he was worthless as a boy. He failed the 11 plus and he went down the coal mine when he was 17 and he didn't leave for 47 years because he thought he wasn't worth shit because he'd been told it by the world. I was walking down the street one day and I came from a rough part of Nottinghamshire. Domestic violence was a backdrop, to our kind of working class lives. And I remember with total clarity now seeing a woman who'd been beaten up by her husband. And my dad made me look. He took me by the arm and he said, son, real men don't do it like that. I can still see it now. I've got a boy who's 7. I say the same thing to him. Let's hear it for the men who are good men and shape men and build great boys, because we don't hear anything about the good stuff men do. I was in Parliament on Tuesday. I've written extensively about the gender education gap. Working class boys like me, like my dad, the worst attainers in all of Britain. Nobody cares in the corridors of power. You have to fight tooth and nail for this to even be identified as an issue, because we cannot see beyond our preconceptions of equality. How can boys suffer inequality? They're born lucky. You've got a penis. Well done. You've won life's lottery. The evidence tells us the opposite, but we seem incapable or unwilling to look beyond this. My mother worked in Nottinghamshire with some of the most violent and excluded boys in the entire county. She went into their homes and wanted to know, which is expensive, and we need to be doing it again right now, why are these boys turning out like this? Why are they becoming violent, disruptive? They can't sit down. They're getting chucked under the scrap heap when they're 11. They're ending up in jail. They're becoming alcoholics. They want to kill themselves. And it's like we don't seem to care. And she said, because they're learning bad habits in absence of strong, powerful, positive male role models. Almost entirely, there was no father in these households. We see everywhere the positive effect that strong, positive men can have on building great boys, and yet society chooses to almost uniformly, denigrate men's worth and seems incapable of acknowledging that if we look and help men through powerful men, then we build great boys. So I want to say it's not masculinity in its absolute presence that's toxic, but what's damaging to these boys. And I saw this in schools in Milton Keynes, the most damaged estate in Milton Keynes. And we are seeing boys being switched back on to education by great role models. We need more male teachers in primary schools. 85% of teachers are now women, which is not to denigrate the role of women. My mother was a teacher. My boy's head is a woman. She's amazing. It's about taking these damaged boys with no positive male role models and putting one into their lives. If we think we care about boys, if we think we care about society in a truly egalitarian way, and we believe in equality, we need to address these very serious issues and forget about the gender war. This whole thing is called gender war. I'm tired of the gender war. I'm tired of men and women being feminist, MRAs. Who cares about these labels anymore? Now, can we not just join together to address these issues and do the best for our boys, because a healthy society needs healthy boys, and we can build them together. Thank you.
So I think I'm going to kind of go over a lot of what Camille said about the changes in society, especially in economic relations. It's actually really important points to bring up about the changing nature of the way people work. Men no longer work with the hands, and actually that kind of I think Camille talked about yesterday, the way men like to project themselves upon society with certain facets that we have naturally is quite important. And working with your hands and being the breadwinner is like extremely important part of masculinity. And nowadays, men are not necessarily primarily the breadwinners within their household, and that fundamentally calls into question what masculinity is. So I think there's large kind of changes to do with the political structure as well, and the kind of socio-economic structure that's really important. At the end of the Cold War, you saw kind of the death of politics, Francis Fukuyama's End of History thesis, and he talks about kind of how we just become the preservers of culture. But during this time, you've seen huge changes in society. So you've seen the rise of what Ulrich Beck, the sociologist, called risk society. That has been really so important to why we started to think about masculinity as toxic. Because what he essentially said is that, or not what he was saying, but what he observed in society in the kind of post-Cold War world, we became overly worried about risk. So if you look now, one of the primary political preoccupations in our time is security above freedom. Now that is extremely important thing to think about. But in the way this looks at boys, if you take rape culture as an example, it fundamentally says that men are a risk to society. Men are a risk to women. Women going out of their homes and coming into interaction with boys and men is extremely risky. Now, what's that telling you? One, it's telling you not to be free to start with. And secondly, it's telling you, one, men are a risk, men are brutes, men are animals. It's secondly telling you something about women as well, that women are vulnerable and unable to kind of negotiate the public world. So the second kind of thing that I think's happened is this rise in therapy culture, which is actually in reaction to risk, like how do we now mitigate risks? It's through therapy. So an example from back in my time at Wyndham College, which was a state boarding school where I worked in a residential pastoral role as well. There's a lot of great kids. There's one young boy who came to join in year 8 at the same time I started, and he said he needed anger management classes. Now, fuck knows why, to be honest, because there was nothing wrong with him. He'd been moved from inner London to go and board in a school in rural Norfolk. Big culture shock, right? First of all, the majority of people in the school were white. He was mixed race. He's come from a school that was predominantly black and had, kind of different cultural outlook on the world. And really, all he was trying to do was assert himself within this peer group, which was actually quite hierarchical, as boys are, and especially his actual year group. It was very hierarchical, and he wasn't particularly good at sports. So what's the way he's going to try and assert himself in the peer group? Well, he's going to try and be a man. He's going to try and show that he's, strong. And so they sent him to anger management classes in reaction to that. All right, and to try and kind of increase his emotional intelligence. So that's a load of crap as well. But then we've also seen the rise of identity politics. And what that's kind of said is that it doesn't matter, the content of your character or the content of your ideas. It matters what's found in your trousers or what the colour of your skin is. So what we are seeing, a change in economic relations, which have caused kind of the traditional forms of masculinity, called it into question, and also created a huge vacuum for men. I kind of disagree with John on the whole suicide thing. Like, I think that has nothing to do with necessarily being male. I think if you look at the work by Emile Durkheim when he did On Suicide, he talks about actually it's a lot to do with economic relations, which comes back into
100 years ago.
100 years ago, yeah. But I think you could actually extrapolate to now and it would still hold true what some of the things he was saying. Secondly, we've seen this rise in risk and the rise in males being seen as a risk, rape culture, lag culture and all this shit. And secondly, and then you've also seen this rise in therapy culture, which is called into question the idea that men should be stoic and self-reliant, or that all people should in fact be stoic and self-reliant, regardless of whether you're a man or a woman. And called into question, we must cry on each other's shoulders and, we should all get around and have a hug and blah, 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 blah. So really, what I want to say is masculinity is not toxic for boys or even for girls or for society in general. It's actually extremely important to a healthy, vibrant and challenging society that masculinity not only is kind of kept intact, but is actually promoted for all people.
Thanks. So lots to talk about there. I'm going to go straight to the audience. Can I see who'd like to speak?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask the panel, where does masculinity come from? I mean, is it hormonal? Is it a property of testicles? Or is it a values, a set of values that therefore can be opened, like Christopher says, could be opened to all of us? Because I think having balls doesn't rely on you having balls. So, where do you locate the properties that give rise to masculinity?
I think the lady just now just spoke very right to the point. The idea that we have balls as being a definition of whether you're brave or not means that men can have them taken away from them, but women can't. I think that's quite an interesting analysis of what bravery means. It's something that shames men, but you can't be shamed as a woman for being afraid. That would be one thing I'd say in response to that. The other question, or the more specific point that I was going to make, was I would like to hear the panel's response to the idea of what the narrative around toxic masculinity does to preventing policy and public concern for the issues that men have. If you locate the blame for men's problems on men and boys themselves as a consequence of their own pathology, how does that affect people's responses to try and doing something about them?
A couple of things. One was, this is a debate on is masculinity toxic for boys? And I'm wondering if anybody's arguing that it is.
Right.
Because I don't see anyone in the panel.
Everybody else in the whole world.
Well, that might be something
bit
we could.
flippant, though,
That might be something we could talk about. Is there such a thing as
50 years
toxic
of feminist
masculinity?
propaganda.
So yeah, on Tuesday I was in Parliament at a roundtable committee meeting, specifically looking at the overriding issue of why are white working class boys the bottom of education's pile right now. We see this, the figures are irrefutable and startling from when these boys enter reception age. They are behind from the very beginning and they never catch up, save for A-star grades at maths. The more kind of autistic sort of end of the spectrum where boys historically have done very well, although that increasingly is leading them to be labelled as ADHD. And when they get labelled, then they believe it and they end up failing. So what I saw was something I'd heard about anecdotally, but didn't believe, because I want to believe the good in people. I want to believe the good in policy. And yet when you're eye to eye with politicians in Parliament and they say to you, we know this is an issue. Mary Kirk, who's the head of UCAS, who's been screaming really for about 15 years at least that boys are behind, and has directly been calling for policy outreach to get people like me, the first working class boy in my family to ever make it to university. Nobody had been to university before me. We were all meant to be coal miners. We didn't want to be. We couldn't be if we wanted. They're all gone. We had to change. We had to smarten up. We had to drag ourselves up by our bootstraps and work hard. And it wasn't because I got a penis, because I got ambition. When you're in Parliament and you say, so what can we do about this? They say, well, we're expecting resistance. And you're like, what? You can barely even get your head around why are we expecting resistance, but when MPs tell you that we will get resistance towards helping who are the bottom of the stack, the lowest attainers, yet politically are still opposed because everybody believes patriarchy, everybody believes the born male, born lucky narrative, it's gobsmacking to see that we cannot drop, our predispositions and our kind of our baggage around equality and actually be gender blind and be race blind and just look at those who need the help most. I think we're failing, boys, because we can't look beyond our own narrow-minded conception of what equality really is.
Right. Anyone else want to come back?
Yeah.
John?
I'd just like to come back on the question of the fact that everybody has the same position, or essentially the same position in the panel. Well, if you want to hear the other point of view, just read The Guardian every day. Listen to the BBC every day. Read the New York Times every day. The Irish Times every day. For 50 years, we've had propaganda, in other words, lies about men. And it's time that we had a little bit of... the only thing that would be achieved by having another contrary view would be that somebody would accuse us of whining on behalf of boys. That's the line that feminists use. I'm sick and tired of it. I don't really want to be part of any discussion with feminists. They have abused and denigrated men for the last 50 years, and I'm sick of it. It is now a lethal activity. Come back to the other things, the other questions. The question there, where does masculinity come from? One word, fatherhood. Fatherhood. That's where it comes from. That's what it's about. So women can't do it.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a number of different points here, which is that my own philosophy, and this is why I'm such a dissident feminist, is that sex differences are based in biology, okay, and that the erasure of biology from the women's studies and now gender studies curriculum, okay, has produced an entire army of propagandists, of feminist thinkers whose views have been adopted by bureaucrats in government and on campuses everywhere. Okay, so you have it's like a massive system of control that's going on, and an obstruction to free thought and free speech that I find extremely serious. Now, I'm speaking from what I regard as a transgender position. I don't think of myself as man or woman. Okay, and my position sort of between the genders is the entire basis, I think, of my analysis. But they have a term like rape culture, okay, being repeated over and over again. Okay, a term of such utter nonsense. Anyone who believes that there is a rape culture on campus, okay, is guilty of the most hysterical kind of thinking. We're dealing with hallucinations. It's a return by secularists, okay, to a notion of hellfire. Men have absolutely been demonized in a way that makes no sense, because when you go to the elite campuses in the United States, you see boys who've been so processed, who are desperate to please women. And the more men try to please women, the more men follow the agenda that women have set for themselves, the less women want them, okay? So women everywhere are unhappy. They're so unhappy. They're unhappy. They're unhappy. Why? Okay, because there are no men anywhere near. The men have been incinerated, okay, in the area around them. Okay, all right. Now, a big theme of my writing, and it's repeated again and again in my new book, okay, is that I find absolutely intolerable the invisibility to bourgeois women academics, okay, of the men who are making the infrastructure around them work. all of the hardest, dirtiest, okay, most thankless work is everywhere in the world is still being done by men, okay? It's the construction projects, when there's a storm and all the electric wires are down. I don't see any women out there doing it. It's the men out there who are doing it. It's the men who are setting the windows in the great towers, who are risking, there's something like a 92, the number of deaths, okay, on work sites around the world, something like 92% of them are men, okay, because it's men who take on those jobs. I just saw a few months ago, I was like driving in the suburbs where I live, I saw there was a huge sewage spill coming from a broken pipe. There were people in hazmat suits, hazard suits, okay, going out there and cleaning this up. Did I see any women there? No, okay, it's men who do this, right? All right. And how stoical men are, okay, and men take this abuse and have been taking it for decade after decade after decade. It's time for a return to the Robert Bly type of men's movement. The men's movement that was still quite vital in the early 90s has completely disappeared. And the women have taken over. Okay, I'm going to stop. I have more.
I think in terms of the question, is masculinity something you find in your trousers or is it a set of values? It's useful actually to compare two women. So if you look at Margaret Thatcher, the first female Prime Minister of the UK, and you look at Hillary Clinton, compare them as women. What people hated about Margaret Thatcher is that she was a man and that she had balls and that she had, she was the Iron Lady. She could both claim to masculinity and claim her own femininity if she wanted as well. Compare that to Hillary Clinton, Grandma Clinton, who's the basis of her campaign is that she's got a vagina and no set of ideas. She doesn't stand up to Donald Trump. She just says, oh, he's a bad guy, he's not a very nice person. Like, would Margaret Thatcher have done that, or did she absolutely obliterated his ideas and challenged them on them? I think that's, is masculinity a set of values? It's something you find in trousers? It's a bit of both, but it's mostly values, and that comparison between those two women kind of proves it, I think.
When we think about traditional masculinity, I think it conjures up ideas of physical strength, of size, of a certain level of what could be termed aggression. And I think that traditional masculinity can be easily skewed towards what toxic, quotes, behaviour, but it doesn't need to be that way, of course. Traditional masculinity, it punishes certain types of boys for being the wrong kind of boy. It punishes gay men, it punishes trans men, it punishes feminine men, it punishes men who don't want to work with their hands. It punishes men who are physically smaller. Sometimes. Over the 20th century, the feminist movement rather wonderfully allowed women to reconceptualize femininity from a single monolith of what a woman should be and turn it into something their femininity into something that was more personal and more meaningful and more real. And I think it's time that we men did that with masculinity, reconceptualize it away from traditional masculinity, twist it for positive things like protecting people, looking after people. I worry that as a trans man, while I transition, that I will have to become something that I'm not, that I will have to take on a certain level of aggression, that I will have to give up being an emotional feeling, sometimes I'm overly emotional, true, that's me, human being, and I worry about that a lot. If masculinity is taught by fathers to their sons are raised as sons, where does that leave someone like me, someone who was raised as a woman? Does that mean when I have sons, I will not be able to teach them what masculinity means to me?
So I think a lot of people identify masculinity with strength, and a lot of times strength is associated with violence. And how do you teach young boys to be strong without being violent? And the reason I ask is because I do jiu-jitsu, MMA, combat sports, and I feel more manly when I'm done with it, quite honestly. My friends ask me, what are you doing what are you doing tonight? I'm like, I'm gonna go train. And that's like it's not violent because it's sport, but I feel more manly than my friends who don't do anything like that. But if they were to be like more manly, they might try to pick a fight at a bar, So how do you teach young men to be masculine without being violent?
I completely agree that there's absolutely nothing positive whatsoever in the rape culture narrative that promotes the idea that men are predatory, that they're a threat to women and a threat to society. And the converse of that, obviously, is the promotion of women as victims and vulnerable. But I do think that equality can be overrated. I think when it's an equality that's premised on equal vulnerability, equal fragility, people being equally in need of protection, quite frankly, that's not an equality that's worth having. And I think there's a danger in the way that the debate's being framed at the moment, that there's this presentation that it's feminism that's emasculating men. And actually, I think sometimes it's men who are promoting this idea of vulnerability and fragility. So I'll just give one quick example. I was taking part in a debate at Cambridge on Friday night, and the guy who I was speaking against was a black man who was the president of the Cambridge Student Union Society. And he said how there is a safe space for black women students at Cambridge, and it's really great because this is very, very well populated. Lots of black women go and take part in this safe space. And then he said there's also another space for black men who are Cambridge students, and it's nobody goes to this safe space. And I'm thinking, great, these black men students at Cambridge, they've got balls, as people have been saying. You know, they've got some self-respect. They are not going to hang out in this safe space. Unfortunately, the conclusion he drew from this was how problematic. Isn't it tragic that these black men students at Cambridge are not going to hang out in this safe space? And what on earth can we do to try and get them into the safe space? Well, that's not an equality that I would want to be part of. That puts us all in a safe space.
It's so refreshing to come into a room about a debate about masculinity and not feel attacked. Yeah. Sorry. The other thing that I wanted to raise was this question raised by the transgender individual. Traditional masculinity, to me, could probably be summed up by one word, and that's bravery. And to be brave is to be vulnerable in situations. And to be brave is to be able to be in a room as a smaller gentleman and not feel intimidated. There is no reason that traditional masculinity has to be about the biggest, strongest, most aggressive person in the room, because that's not fundamentally what it's about.
I think in answer to the kind of, should we reconceptualise masculinity, or like, what about the association of violence with strength? One of the biggest problems here now is boys not doing sports, or children in general not going out and doing sports. Like, one of the greatest things about, I never played rugby myself, but one of the greatest things to think about is that you can go out and be violent and aggressive, and at the end of the game, you shake hands. Like, that's a real positive message to send out to boys, that you can be both, strong, violent, aggressive in a kind of controlled and directed way. What we really need to promote is boys getting outside and running around, kicking about, and throwing balls around or whatever. I think that's like one of the most positive things about masculinity is sport, and that's one thing that's like sorely missing from society now, is the promotion of competitive sport.
The first notion that traditional masculinity isn't about protecting, I think, is absurd. I mean, look at the amount of men that died in wars, protecting, our freedom and rebuilding this country. They seem to be conveniently overlooked. In as far as rebranding or helping men to be caring, I do agree that should men be more nurturing? Is that their choice? Whatever. I went to Sweden. I was so fed up of being told that British dads were crap, because I'm a British dad, and that upsets me. And Swedish dads are amazing, and why can't we be more like Swedish dads? I went there, and I spent weeks with a bunch of Swedish dads, and I learned something really fundamental. Society values dads in Sweden. It pays them 80% of their salary for 12 months. It values them, it gives them daddy months, use it or lose it. And so men were bribed to be dads. They were paid, they were valued, and when they were valued, they took upon more feminine role. And it wasn't more feminine because they were valued and paid, and their peers did it. And they were men to be protecting and providing and nurturing. But that was because society gave them permission and didn't denigrate them. In the UK, you get 139 quid a week to be a stay-at-home dad, right? If you compare that to the maternity packages that many women get here, is there any wonder we've got 1% take-up in shared parental leave in the UK? That's where Sweden was in 1974. We're 40 years behind. That's not because dads don't want to be, amazing fathers. It's not because dads feel, as I did, to my shame really, when I was a stay-at-home dad, I felt like this is what a man does. My dad was a miner. He never changed nappies. I didn't learn those skills from my dad. I had to learn them on the hoof, as many men no doubt in this room have, with little help, and at the same time being ridiculed. So what I'm saying is, if we want to encourage men to be more nurturing, we have to value them and not just tell them that you're not doing this because you don't want to. We do. We want to change, but we don't want to be forced into it or shamed into it. We want to be valued, and then we will step up and do it.
I want to make some remark about the war, because I think that my positive view of men definitely comes from the fact that my father and all of my uncles went to war. 5 uncles. My father was in the Pacific Theater as a paratrooper, and my uncles were in the Battle of the Bulge, wounded there, and all kinds of things. And I come from an Italian immigrant background where I saw no examples of male brutality. I saw men working all day long for their families. My culture regarded as scandalous to have for any man to abuse a woman. Okay, in the old country, a rapist, would end up dead and castrated, hung out to dry, okay, the next morning. And I've noticed too many of the leading feminists, okay, came from disordered family backgrounds where there was a negligent or abusive father. Okay, and I don't like the way their personal dramas, and from Gloria Steinem on down, the way they have projected their psychodrama onto all men everywhere. I think the evidence of history is overwhelming. Okay? How men have sacrificed their lives for women and children. So a tiny minority who have been abusive. Okay, that is the historical record, and it is terrible. Okay, that feminist rhetoric, okay, is injecting this animosity against men into young women. Okay, who are in this age of social media and a world of alternate reality. Okay, have accepted this horror story. Okay, of rape culture as the actual fact of the sexual landscape. I reject it completely.
Just to answer the question from the transgender person, what you're asking for, what we've done actually to resolve the question you've asked, and we've spent 40 years trying to do this, is we've inverted the pyramid, and we've lost, to mix my metaphors, we've lost 95% of boys and men off the back of the lorry while trying to deal with the minority up at the front. We cannot continue that policy. It is lethal to men. The strength of that violence, the answer to that is in Iron John. I mean, there's a particularly beautiful section by Robert Bly where he talks about the knife which is used in the ritual in which the wound is conferred on the boy, the wound to match the wound of the woman. And he says that when you don't do that, men find other uses for knives. That's your answer about the difference. There is a difference between strength and violence. The question of, a very interesting question about the frugality, the quality of fragility, and it's a great phrase, and that is a real problem, that we've created a culture in which the only currency is victimhood. And I really resent that. But unfortunately, we're in this terrible situation where you have to go before courts to plead for your life or your relationship with your daughter or your son. And you need to actually play out this drama, this language of victimhood, because that's the only thing that gets you anything. If you are not, Bob Geldof, talked about this, the idea of don't say you love your children if you're going to a court. But you're competing in an arena which is emotional, and in which the mother has all the cards, and you're dealing also with the residue of another culture, of chivalry, wherein the judge, usually a male, who is acting Sir Galahad for the woman and punishing the man, because that's the way he can act out his manhood, his screwed up manhood. So it's but the problem is, you see, there's the law. It's all very well. It's not just about safe spaces. That's all very well in the campuses. There's a little bit of recreational sort of activity. But I'm talking about, for example, family law courts. Since I came here on Friday, I've been in touch with 2 men in Dublin who are suicidal because of the way they've been treated in family courts. I'm not a journalist anymore, but I'm still an amateur counsellor because I deal with all this, because nobody else wants to talk about it and nobody else wants to talk to these men. So we're dealing with life and death issues here. We're not talking about academic, intellectual concepts. We're dealing with real real lives. And I have seen a tremendous, unbelievable brutalization of men in the last 20 years since I started getting into this subject. I saw brutalization of myself, but I don't even dwell on that. You know, one day I'll write a book about it. I'm looking forward to actually being diagnosed. See, this is the interesting thing. LGBT people can tell their story. Trans people can tell their story. I can't, as a man, tell my story because I'll be put in jail. But I'll tell you one thing. There is... It isn't. It is not. If I speak about the... I fought for my daughter before a family law court, which is in secret. And if I speak about it in any detail in public, I will be put in jail. Do you understand, sir? If you call yourself sir. Now, but I have one thing I say, one thing I do say, I do hope for this, that one day I will be diagnosed with a terminal illness, I will be given 6 months notice of my death, and then I will write the book, and they can sue my dead ass.
Right, I'm going to take some more.
The stuff you're mentioning is endemic to Western culture, and it's done in that vacuum. Masculinity is not going to go away. So I'd like to see you guys address kind of the warrior instinct that's missing when it comes to active jihad. When the West hears about an act of jihad, we're told by our media, you can be sad, but you can't be angry. If you're angry, you're kind of cuckoo reactionary. So I'd like to hear about the warrior instinct and why that's necessary for the West to preserve itself, if you can.
So something that crosses my mind often when you talk about toxic masculinity and propaganda in the media is, who started all this? Who started this sudden scare about masculinity? Did one of these, these cultural Marxist, feminazi, liberal cucks sneak into the media and go, hey, you know what? Let's completely change everything. Let's completely change our ideals towards women because I can, because I'm an evil feminist, because I can manipulate people. That didn't happen, did it? And there is still no denial that there are men's problems. It's complete bullshit to deny that there are problems with men. It's complete bullshit to deny that men are often victims of rape and don't get acknowledged for that. There are a lot of crimes which men are not acknowledged for, even though they are the victims of them. And we are not denying that as these cultural Marxist, liberal, feminazi cucks. We are standing in solidarity, because never have I ever, in my personal experience, seen a men's rights activist actively try and start a men's shelter for men who have been in abusive relationships. And never have I seen a men's rights activist start a petition. This is my personal experience. It might be completely different for any of you. But in mine, I have never seen that. I've just seen these internet men's rights activists complaining.
And you base your entire experience of men caring about men's issues on a few idiot MRAs on Reddit forums? Come on.
Well, right, that's my personal
you can come back in a minute.
Yours might be completely different.
Hi, I want to come to what Martin said earlier about male role models missing in schools in early life. I think that's not only important to give men a new sense of themselves, but to give all of us a new sense of masculinity, because these pictures are also lacking for us young women, because we've also just been raised by women. And I wonder if the panel could think about, because I am a feminist, but I always thought that feminism meant equality, so I'm surprised to learn at this debate that apparently in this country this is not the case. So does the panel think that we have created rape culture by taking men's masculinity away? Like by not teaching them how to be good, brave men, but basically just demonizing them? I'd be interested to hear what you think about that.
Okay, so my question for the panel is, do you think there is more than one form of masculinity in society? And if so, do you see all forms of masculinity as toxic or non-toxic?
Right, I'm going to take the panel back. I also want to ask my own question, which is, of course, women are warriors too now. So how does that fit into the warrior question?
Yes. Let me respond about the feminism question here, which is that there are several strains of feminism. I myself am an equity feminist. I believe that the mission of feminism is to achieve an equality of opportunity for women in the public realm, and that all obstacles to women's advance in the professional and political spheres are removed. But not everyone believes that. Okay? Many others believe in special protections for women, in a quota system for women. Okay? So there are many other strands. And then the young woman who is saying that somehow we're blaming everything on feminism, I'm afraid you're too young to have experienced, okay, the first phase of feminism, which went off the rails very quickly. Okay, I was part of it right from the start, and the kind of vindictiveness and ostracism and the monomania, okay, of feminist dogma as it took shape. There was a war after war that I fought, defending the Rolling Stones, okay, trying to defend fashion photography and Hollywood and sex symbols, and I mean all kinds of things that now are common coin to today's feminists. Okay, there was a period when everything about Charlie's Angels, the Bond girls. I mean, just war after war after war. Okay, was fought about the pornography. Okay, the Andrew Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon. Okay, had waged a war against Playboy magazine, as calling it hate literature equal to the writings of the Nazis and Klansmen and so on. So I'm sorry, okay, the present stage of feminism is actually much more open towards sexual issues than it was before. That's all I want to say.
Yeah, I want to talk about the warrior instinct, of course, is the most poisonous of all forms of masculinity, if you believe, mankind's kind of attackers. Bring it back to the earlier point, of course, men died for our freedom with this warrior instinct that we despise. And then, of course, when we look to jihadis, we look at them as, well, that's not because they're men. It's not because they're Muslim men or they were poisoned by a faith. It's just because they're men. I think toxic masculinity is a great get-out-of-jail card for just blaming men for everything that's terrible about being a man. The whole thing about male role models, the best way I can sort of describe that is, as part of my stepping up to find out the solution to this boy crisis in education, I went around the world looking for solutions, because I like to do that. Rather than blaming men or damning boys, like, well, how can we sort this mess out? There are two schemes. There's one in New York, which is called the Young Men's Initiative. It's an amazing charity set up to recruit directly 1,000 male teachers of colour, because the worst performers in New York are black, impoverished boys who are the bottom of the heap. Over here, they're white boys, in America, they're black, but it's the same shit, different city. And so what they did, they have directly reached out with President Obama's help, outgoing president, and the mayor of New York to specifically say, they asked these kids, what do you want in the classroom? They said, people like us. We don't see anybody like us. We see 95% of the teachers being women, most of them being white, and they don't relate to them. They often don't have fathers at home. So we know that there is an incredibly positive role for male role models if we can just get beyond our own kind of prejudice of being able to hire them without that being sexist, because it would be, of course, to hire men. Is there more than one form of masculinity? Well, of course there is. I mean, a gay man is celebrating, I would say, a different kind of masculinity to a heterosexual man. A Muslim man might be a different form of masculinity, but it's only really safe to demonise one form of masculinity, and that's really the heteronormative, white, Caucasian. That's the problem, isn't it? Yeah. All the rest are fine.
Chris?
So I think, coming back to the young woman, one of the biggest problems men now face are actually meninists. Meninists propagate the same kind of crap that feminists do about everyone being vulnerable and everybody needing, a shoulder to cry on. That is now a huge problem facing men. They meninists themselves also go on about this problem with, toxic masculinity and the inability of them being able to show their emotions and all that type of stuff. So I think, like, when you like come onto it, what are men doing for men? Like, not very much, probably. Can there be like more than one form of masculinity? Well, leading on from what Marn just said, like, yeah, you can make, and to the gentleman in the middle there, like, you can make masculinity what you want. There's no reason why, living in a free society, you can't be who you want to be and make the most of of what forms of masculinity you want to pick and choose from. That's like a great thing living in a free 21st century society. But I think what we're trying to say is that the problems facing men and the problems of toxic masculinity are taking away the best bits of masculinity, which is kind of strength and bravery and stoicism and self-reliance. That's the biggest problem I see. How you want to form your own masculinity is up to you, I don't care. But you have to recognise that those traits are very positive things to have for men, and not only for men, but for women to hold as well.
The question about girls, of course, it is absolutely true that this affects girls as well. I'm a father of a daughter, and in my experience, that there is a vital part of the relationship between a father and a daughter that is just as important as that between a father and a son, and just important for the girl, because essentially what the father, this isn't a clear-cut divide, but what the father does by the contradistinction with the mother, the father, in a sense, snatches the child from the mother and liberates the child into the world, and tells the child that the world is a safe place, that the world can be negotiated. The mother tends to hold and protect the child, nurture the child. That's broadly, crudely, in a caricature. But nevertheless, this is important to both sexes. Feminism equals equality, of course, but it doesn't. Not equality as meant in the dictionary. And that is one of the great corruptions of our time, because that word has been appropriated now by all kinds of factions. But they don't mean equality. They certainly don't mean that men are entitled to be treated in this as fairly as women. They do not mean that, and have never meant that. So they don't mean equality. I don't know what they mean. They mean whatever we say, whatever we want. Of course, there are more. There are as many kinds of masculinity as there are men. You can't categorize it. There is no such thing. It doesn't depend on strength. But nevertheless, to come to the warrior thing, strength is an important part, and strength should be respected. You know, men go to war. Men will go to war. We will need men again. I respect men. I salute men. My uncles were soldiers too, like Camille's. The freedoms we have are down to men's battles, just as other things are down to the things that women have done. But this has been totally denigrated, and even the word warrior is now being demonized. I salute warriors. We need more of them. There's one further thing, one last thing I want to say. This idea that men have difficulty expressing their emotions, to go back to the masculinity, is absolute rubbish. If you want to know, if you want to see this, go to a secret room, go to a private room, go to a room of Alcoholics Anonymous, and listen carefully to the difference between the men share and the way the women share. And that would blow your cliches and your prejudices out of the water. Because men, when they have a safe place, to use that appalling new phrase, safe space, to speak where they're not being demonized and they're not being attacked, will pour their hearts out, not in a bleating way, but in a way that gets to the very core of their humanity. I have heard that thousands upon thousands of times.
I just want to say that the warrior persona is at the heart of my own philosophy of street-smart Amazon feminism. That's what I call my movement. And it's based, a lot of it is based, there's a whole chapter in my first book, Sexual Personae, on Edmund Spencer's Fairy Queen, with its women warriors. You have Britomart, who is an armorer, and there's Belphoebe, who is an Amazon warrior. And I feel that there's a lot of wisdom about sexual experience and sexual differences in that poem. It presents the full spectrum of sexual personae. It presents men who veer toward the violent and the brutish, and then the men who are refined in the chivalric style, men who become noble warriors and are able to balance their emotions. And on the female side of the spectrum, Spencer sees the danger to women as victimhood, as excessive vulnerability. So you have this Florimel character, okay, who's hysterical, okay, and who actually induces attacks of rapists on her, okay, by her persona of helplessness. And this is the model that I'm presenting to women, that women should not be depending any longer, okay, on an apparatus, an authoritarian apparatus of government, okay, or of administrators and campuses and grievance committees and so on. That every woman must take responsibility, okay, for herself and for the environment around her, for dealing with reality, and it's based on my admiration of men.
So for as old as warfare has existed, men and women have fought in war, and they've had success, and guess what? They're working as a team, they're working in partnership. Women have been as equally honourable, as warrior-like, and as brave as men have been throughout times. It's just in very different circumstances. So it seems to me that toxic masculinity is sort of this vogue nonsense term in probably what is just sort of a nonsense framing of the problem, which is gender wars. Can we just call it gender peace? We actually want to get on together and actually work together and actually look at all these problems, because the problems aren't actually toxic masculinity. The problems are people who are narcissistic, people who are sociopaths, people who are abuse of power. I came from an abusive marriage. Women are a lot more powerful than you realise. And men are equally a lot more powerful than you realise. And for all the different forms of masculinity there might be, surely one of them is looking at someone like Donald Trump in the eye and saying, mate, you are a bit of a tosspot. And maybe getting self-regulating and working with each other.
The whole masculinity promoting violence thing that I've heard a few times in some earlier panels as well, I'd like to see people say masculinity is violent when men are out protecting you and keeping the bad people away. And I'd like to also touch on men opening up their feelings. And men do want to talk about their feelings, they do want to open up, but every time they do, they get shit on. Eva Wiseman wrote this piece. She wrote an article last Halloween or the Halloween before called "Is There Anything Worse Than a Man Who Cries?" and spent the whole article deriding men who open their feelings, how shock and horror a man can open up and let out his feelings. And this sort of thing pushed out into the public realm, becoming part of the social narrative that men who talk about how they feel is a bad thing, and you wonder why they don't open up, you wonder why they bottle up their feelings and end up killing themselves. And my final point, I'll be quick, I do promise. To the lady about men making domestic violence shelters, they're trying. The issue is funding. Women's Aid estimatedly gets about $295 million a year, yet the Mankind Initiative struggles to get 50 grand a year just to keep their phone lines open. There are many, many people trying to open male domestic violence shelters, but nobody wants to pay for them.
It's important to look where masculinity comes from. Camille pointed out that biology has been erased from feminism. I write science papers, review papers on biological roots of human sociality. The fundamental problem in biology is the accumulation of gene replication error. How do you get rid of it? The reason why we have separate mating types, why we have sex in separate mating types rather than just hermaphrodites, is because you partition all the reproduction on the female side. The dealing with the gene replication error is partitioned on the male side, which is why you have males competing with each other for status. The status is a measure of genetic quality. The female role is to carefully choose the males. And that is the basis of the sex divide.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say, you keep talking about rape culture and you're saying it doesn't exist, and you said that women are responsible for rape culture because we should make sure that we're responsible for ourselves. How can you say something like that? If I went on to the... No, the woman in the middle, you said we are responsible for it. You can't say something like that because women can go onto the streets on a day-to-day basis and...
Don't ask for responsibility from women for their own lives. I have broken the law of feminism by daring to request women to take responsibility.
No, but we're taking responsibility for our own lives, but it's not our fault. If you get raped, it's never the victim's fault.
I didn't say it was your fault. I said it's up to you to take responsibility for your life. Do not depend on proxy parent figures to protect you after the fact.
The panel seems to be focusing on the fact that this aspect of rape culture that is demonising men. This is one aspect of rape culture. Rape culture also looks at the fact of victim blaming. If you look at the Ched Evans case that happened recently, that woman, she had to change her identity 5 times. She had to move houses, but because her identity is exposed, that's not allowed in court. A part of the law that says that she's not allowed to, her previous sexual history shouldn't have been brought up in court. That was brought up in court when really that shouldn't have been allowed. This is rape culture, and by you saying women should take responsibility for their own lives, yes, I do agree that women should take responsibility for their own lives. That's an obvious.
It's incredible. I mean, it's incredible how brainwashed.
Right. You know what? We're gonna.
Stereotypical thinking. The cliches. The endless cliches.
That's like saying, that's like saying
thinking.
someone's going out into the street. You're running risk of getting shot by going out into the street. You don't ask someone to wear a bulletproof vest every single time they go out into the street, do you? You should treat. Why don't we start teaching the rapists to stop raping and start teaching people to stop raping people?
Right. We're down to the last 5 minutes, so I'm going to take the panel back now.
There's an important part to masculinity, which is, or important traits of masculinity, which are vital to a thriving, vibrant democracy, which is stoicism, self-reliance, bravery, and the ability to stand up and speak your mind, and for somebody not to take offence against that. If we're going to get rid of all these traits of masculinity, we're going to soon find that we live in a very authoritarian, dictatorial society. Masculinity is extremely important, or the traits that are held by masculinity are extremely important to a thriving democracy. I'll come back again to the example of Margaret Thatcher and Hillary Clinton, two real opposing kind of idols of femininity, I guess, and masculinity. One, the Iron Lady, who took no shit from anybody and bashed anybody about intellectually when she needed to, and the other one who stands back and doesn't challenge anybody and just relies on her vagina and the fact that she's a grandmother to make political point scoring.
Okay, to summarise, I want to focus on toxic masculinity as a phrase. I think, like the Bible, it's a great story, but it doesn't stand up to any real scrutiny of factual evidence. For example, how does toxic masculinity explain the fact that we've seen a tenfold increase in violence against men in the last 6 years in the UK? How does it explain the fact that working class boys are at the bottom of the pile? How does it explain the fact that young men in the 20s now earn less than women in the 20s? We've seen we've seen a complete flip of all we understand about equality within a very quick period of time, and yet we still seem hooked up on blaming men for their own failures, which to me is the very antithesis, the opposite of equality and egalitarianism. And I think if we're going to end this gender war, I agree with the fella at the back, can we just try and call peace? And I also just want to dwell on this kind of idea that this is some kind of how anti-feminist. I don't see that. When I sort of speak to people, my missus is over there, she's a feminist. I've got 2 kids with her. Why do you have to be anti-feminist to care about men's issues? It's ludicrous. And I think it's damaging of this debate. If we want to end the gender war, we join forces to end inequality. And some of that can be against men and boys. Thank you.
I believe that a lot of these problems would be remedied if we could return or actually insert the study of biology into women's studies and gender studies, because there's absolutely no doubt, okay, that there are sexual differences and that the hormones, even transgender people injecting themselves with the hormones of the opposite sex, okay, experience both physical and emotional and psychological changes, from those hormones. It's not that I'm a biological determinist. I'm not. As I said, I feel I'm between the genders. But we do need, okay, a liberation from the current cliches, 40 years of cliches, okay, in feminism. I think the young women today who are I consider myself a feminist. I am not in any way anti-feminist. I think there is that women need to realize how they've become the victim of a certain kind of propaganda and cliche. Okay, and the more a term like rape culture is used, I think the less we'll ever be able to look at a sexual experience accurately.
I want to make 2 points. One is in relation to this thing of joining forces. I thought so too 20 years ago. I thought that having come from a left-liberal position, I was an editor of left-liberal magazines, I belonged to all this. Didn't question it. And then when I stumbled upon this injustice towards fathers in the family courts and the things that were arising from that, as it were, I ran back to my former colleagues, my compadres, and said, come quickly, I've just found the most shocking injustice, you'll be very interested, you're going to want to stop this. And they did. What did they do? They kicked my head in. And they've been kicking my head in ever since. This is not permitted. You're not permitted to talk about these things by feminists. So there's no possibility of a joining the forces, in my opinion.
I live in hope.
So the second thing I want to go back to, you see, when you suppress real masculinity, true masculinity, something else happens. Like your garden. If you don't cultivate your garden, you get weeds. Now, I want to say this. I want to be careful because I don't want to join in the kind of supercilious prating about Donald Trump. I love Donald Trump. I actually admire him in a certain way. Donald Trump was the only kind of guy who could break through this bullshit. And now he's there. And now he's there. He's like R.P. McMurphy. And I'll tell you, if you put on R.P. McMurphy, if you put on Cuckoo's Nest now, the men in this audience would have to keep their mouths shut because they couldn't pretend to like R.P. McMurphy, but they would. And it's the same with Donald Trump. And that's why he's going to win. Believe it or not. You heard it here last.
Right, well, you've heard it from John. Right, I'd like to thank our panel and the audience. Thanks a lot for a good discussion.